Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Andrew Lunny, and I am a senior studying here at the university, concentrating upon both history and art history as my major and minor fields, respectively. On behalf of the Hope Horn Gallery at the University of Scranton, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening events of the first exhibition of our 2012-2013 season, the Lackawanna Iron Furnaces of Scranton, Pennsylvania, History, Art, and Heritage. The Lackawanna Iron Furnaces, known today as the Scranton Iron Furnaces, stand along the banks of Roaring Brook, a tributary of the Lackawanna River near the outskirts of the namesake city in Pennsylvania. Maintained by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission as part of its Anthracite Heritage Museum complex, the site showcases remnants of the Lackawanna Iron Furnaces, roughly 40 feet in height and a combined 200 feet in length. The four connected stone blast furnace stacks dating from 1848 to 1857 are vestiges of the region's 19th century anthracite iron industry. Founded and fostered by a close-knit group of entrepreneurs, the Lackawanna Iron Furnaces were established in 1840 by Iron Master William Henry, developed throughout the 1850s by brothers Selden and George Scranton, and expanded during the 1860s by cousin Joseph Hand Scranton. Emerging as one of the earliest producers of T-rail in the United States, the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, later known as the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company, grew by 1894 to become the third largest steel mill in the nation. Facing increased competition, however, the company relocated to Buffalo, New York in 1902. The Lackawanna Iron Furnaces were closed and abandoned for over 60 years. Acquired by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1969, the 4-acre site was reclaimed as a park through the Department of Environmental Resources. Control of the rededicated Scranton Iron Furnaces passed to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in 1971. In 1991, the site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In recognition of the 21st anniversary of this designation, the Hope Horn Gallery at the University of Scranton is pleased to present the Lackawanna Iron Furnaces of Scranton, Pennsylvania, History, Art, Heritage. Many individuals and organizations have helped to make this exhibition and its related programming a reality. We thank Mary Ann Moran Savakanis, Executive Director, and her staff at the Lackawanna Historical Society for their assistance in researching the furnaces and their willingness to lend artifacts for the exhibition. We also thank Chester Kalesa, Historic Site Administrator, Pennsylvania Anthracite Heritage Museum, and Scranton Iron Furnaces Eastern Division Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums, Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, his staff at the Anthracite Heritage Museum, and Robert Savakainis, President, Anthracite Museum and Iron Furnaces Associates, for sharing information about the industrial history of Scranton and helping to produce events at the Scranton Iron Furnaces. Maureen McGuigan, Deputy Director, Lackawanna County Council on Arts, Culture, and Education, and Dan Perry, Chief Operating Officer, Lackawanna Heritage Valley, has also been supportive of this project. The Lackawanna Iron Furnaces of Scranton, Pennsylvania, History, Art, Heritage, and its programming have been supported by a Lackawanna County Arts and Culture grant, a program of the Lackawanna County Commissioners and the Lackawanna County Council on Arts, Culture, and Education. Additional support has been provided by the Lackawanna Heritage Valley. The Hope Horn Gallery at the University of Scranton also receives state's art funding support through a grant from the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, a state agency funded by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the National Endowment for the Arts, a federal agency. Our lecture this evening on the Lackawanna Iron Furnaces, Histories and Images will be presented by Dr. Darlene Miller-Lanning, Director of the Hope Horn Gallery and adjunct faculty in the Art and Music Program, History Department at the University of Scranton. I now invite my friend Darlene forward.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and again, Andrew thanked a lot of people who helped to make this exhibition possible, and it's been my good fortune to work with everyone at the Anthracite Heritage Museum and the Lackawanna Historical Society on furnace-related projects for many, many years, and also, most recently, I thank Andrew Lunny for all of his help in getting everything up and off the ground for this evening. In the century and a half since their construction, the Lackawanna iron furnaces have figured prominently in the growth, decline, and revitalization of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Founded in 1840, abandoned in 1902, and reclaimed in 1969, the furnaces have been the subject of many histories. Indeed, by 1891, as clergyman David Kraft observed in his History of Scranton, Pennsylvania, so much had been written about the furnaces by previous authors, there was as little necessity as opportunity for original research in these matters. The only merit that could be claimed, if any, he maintained, would be the condensation of valuable material that they have left, and the addition of such matter as the company itself saw fit to furnish. While the chronological and technological developments of the Lackawanna iron furnaces have been well documented, little has been written about the furnace's representation in art. In Scranton and beyond, there exists a specialized yet extensive body of drawings, paintings, photographs, and architecture associated with the Lackawanna iron furnaces, which, within the historical context of the company and the community, documents early ideals of ambition and enterprise, explores contradictory perspectives on nature and industry, represents diverse concerns of labor and management, and celebrates civic pride in landmarks and milestones. The theme of our exhibition season is landmarks and milestones. We are celebrating special places, which are landmarks, and special times, like the 21st anniversary of the nomination to the National Register for the furnaces. So those are special places in time, so there are milestones. So we have landmarks and milestones this year. In addition, consideration of these artworks and artifacts offers insight into relationships that exist between the industrial history of the Lackawanna iron furnaces and the cultural heritage of Scranton. These are the furnaces as of May. I happened to be driving by one day, and it had been raining all day long, and the sun cleared for a second and shone in a really beautiful way on the facade of the furnaces. And also, it was the first time I really saw the completed Loyola Science Center that is now on campus in relation to the furnaces. So that's a fairly recent image of a structure that's, very old in terms of the history that we're talking about here. Themes of ambition and enterprise were embodied in many early images of the Lackawanna iron furnace, which appeared as drawings and illustrations embellishing local histories, stock certificates, and city maps. Publications like physician Horace Hollister's History of the Lackawanna Valley, released in editions with and without illustrations in 1857 and 1869, commonly told the tale of William Henry, whose dates are 1794 to 1878, an ironmaster from New Jersey who visited a small village in northeastern Pennsylvania. There, according to Hollister, on the low, wild, narrow strip of land lying almost in the forks of the Lackawanna and Roaring Brook, from which Scranton itself seems to have exhaled, Henry found iron ore, the analysis of which proved so productive and inviting as to determine at once the site of the furnace. Prior to Henry's visit, the area was sparsely populated. During the 18th century, conflicting charters granted the territory to both the Connecticut and Pennsylvania colonies. As a result, many settlers from New England came to the Lackawanna Valley as members of the Susquehanna Company, which sought to develop the region under the Connecticut claim. Born in Rhode Island, Isaac Tripp established a homestead along the Lackawanna River at a place called Providence, named for Providence, Rhode Island, in 1771, while Philip Abbott of Connecticut built a home and gristmill along the Roaring Brook around 1788. Abbott's mill was purchased by John Howe around 1790 and sold in 1797 to Ebenezer and Benjamin Slocum, the grandsons of Isaac Tripp. Between 1800 and 1828, the Slocum brothers operated a gristmill, sawmill, and iron forge in the settlement, which was variously known as Dark Hollow, Skunk Hollow, or Slocum Hollow. A simple line illustration included in Hollister's second edition history depicted the Slocum's old red house and its modest surroundings. This was the rural settlement that William Henry was destined to change. The illustration at the top of the PowerPoint image here is the Slocum settlement along Roaring Brook around 1840 when William Henry comes into the area. It's interesting in the exhibition when you visit the show, look for similar subjects represented in different mediums. This is a line drawing. We also have a photograph of the Slocum House from the late 1860s, so it's interesting to compare the two. The first man over here, I'm backward, is William Henry. Son of a Moravian gunsmith, William Henry was born in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Trained as a geologist, he operated the Oxford Furnace in Belvidere, New Jersey, where, in 1835, he became the first iron master in the country to use the hot blast process. Henry traveled to Slocum Hollow in 1836 while scouting routes for a canal and railroad. Attracted to the region's ready supplies of water, coal, and iron ore, he considered the location ideal for the construction of an iron furnace fueled by anthracite. Before a furnace could be built, however, partners needed to be recruited and properties acquired. Henry initially sought the support of a wealthy friend, Edward Armstrong, who unexpectedly died. Plan B. When this business connection crumbled, a family alliance prevailed. This is Selden Scranton. Henry secured backing from his daughter Ellen's husband, Selden Scranton, whose dates are 1814 to 1891, and his brother George Whitfield Scranton, 1811 to 1861. The Scrantons, too, were New Jersey ironmen, and along with the Belvidere merchant Sanford Grant, joined Henry in 1840 to establish the firm of Scranton, Grants and Company. The group purchased property along Roaring Brook and began the construction of a blast furnace. A blast furnace, if you are not familiar with blast furnace building, is basically a very large chimney, and this is an illustration from Frederick Overman's Treatise on Metallurgy from 1852. And it's a cross-section of an anthracite blast furnace. Basically what you do is build a big stone chimney, and then you would fill it with limestone, iron ore, and anthracite, build a fire under it, and hopefully the iron ore will melt out and come out an arch at the front as molten metal, and it will flow into beds of sand and make what are called pigs, little chunks of iron that can then be shaped into other items. Initially, the Scrantons and William Henry had hoped to do that. It wasn't quite as easy as they first anticipated. During the fall of 1841, the completed furnace was filled with layers of iron ore, limestone, and anthracite, ingredients necessary for heating, purifying, and producing iron, but attempts made to light or blow in the facility were unsuccessful. Air passages at the back of the furnace, which are down here, called tuyères, became clogged, and hardened material, or salamander, if you think of iron that melted and then rehardened, that's salamander, had to be dug out of the stack. So you've basically got this gigantic chimney full of melted, congealed rock and iron that needs to be extracted. In January of 1842, the Scrantons sought the advice of John Davis, a Welsh iron master experienced in casting iron with anthracite, who's working in Danville, Pennsylvania. In his historical notes of 1887, physician and author Benjamin Troup recalled that Davis suggested modifications, and in keeping with an old custom from the iron districts of Wales, maintained, in order to have good luck with the new furnace, a lady must apply the match. Mary McKinney Grant, wife of Sanford Grant and sister to Troup's wife, Harriet McKinney Troup, was escorted to the furnace where she kindled the flame of Scranton's prosperity that finally proved a success. When you read histories of Scranton that were produced in the 1800s, there are a lot of stories about great men, but in there, in little places, you can also find histories of women, and we've already got two of them. We've got William Henry's daughter, Ellen, being Selden Scranton's wife. That's a connection that brings him into the business. And we've got Mary McKinney Grant lighting the furnace. So they are there. They're a little hard to find, not as obvious as the guys. But they are definitely part of this process of founding and establishing the furnaces and also the city. With the furnace in operation, Scranton Company struggled to make the enterprise profitable. Discouraged, William Henry left the business in 1842, so he was there 2 years. The firm continued on, producing first pig iron, then nails, and over the next 4 years, high shipping costs combined with low product quality brought the company to the verge of financial ruin. In 1846, Joseph Hand Scranton, 1813 to 1872, a businessman from Augusta, Georgia, and cousin to Selden and George Scranton, joined the firm, as did his sister Catherine's husband, another connection, Joseph Curtis Platt, 1816 to 1887. Sanford Grant retired. Reorganized as Scrantons and Platt, the faltering company fortuitously contracted with the New York and Erie Railroad to produce iron T-rails, previously imported from Great Britain. The plan drew wealthy financiers from New York City, who toured the ironworks and invested in it as special partners. Hollister later wrote that Benjamin Loader, then president of the Erie Company, stated in a public speech that nothing but the prompt fulfillment of this contract averted the bankruptcy of the road. For the Scranton Group, Hollister added, the new alliance evoked lifelong results, as men whose common interests and joint sacrifices and struggles had bound them together felt the invigorating and fervid influence of this great sale of iron, which gave the valley a prospect and a prominence it had never before enjoyed. So those are the four main founders. Other investors were also associated, but William Henry, Selden Scranton, George Scranton, and then finally Joseph Hand Scranton, who will be the person we talk about most just because he's the person who stayed the longest. In 1853, the burgeoning firm of Scrantons and Platt reorganized once again as the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company. Under this name, some 8,000 shares of stock were issued and facilities expanded. Images on a Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company stock certificate of 1853 reflected the company's growth as well as its lucrative new connections with railroading. While a vertical illustration on the side of the piece depicted a traditional scene of ironmasters at a forge wielding hammers against anvils, the certificate's central vignette featured a bustling furnace complex embraced by a curving railroad. A locomotive proudly traversed the line, adding its steam cloud to those 11 smokestacks rising from the foundry. So this is one of the earliest representations associated with the furnaces, 1853. Again, the really early images are on documents. They're not paintings, they're not photographs, but they tend to be on paperwork. They tend to be plans or maps or, again, things like this, documents, stock certificates. And I don't think it actually is the Scranton iron furnaces. I think it's kind of iron furnace, you know, like the hopeful dream of an iron furnace. And the guys over here on the anvil are also, you know, pretty traditional in terms of what you do when you work with iron and blacksmithing and things of that nature. As the Lackawanna iron furnaces prospered, so did the hamlets surrounding them. Noting this trend, George Scranton especially worked hard to promote urban development, believing that investments in community infrastructure would have a reciprocal effect on business opportunities. The iron company had made provisions for workers' housing since the 1840s, and a ramshackle settlement sprang up opposite the furnaces known as Shanty Hill. New employment opportunities soon attracted immigrants from England, Wales, Ireland, and Germany. During the next decade, as the population of the Lackawanna Valley grew from 1,169 in 1840 to 7,143 in 1850, that's in 10 years, concerted efforts were made to develop additional business and residential districts. A variety of names, including Harrison and Scrantonia, were substituted for the old designation of Slocum Hollow, and finally, Scranton stuck. The year 1857 was a significant one for Scrantonians, as it marked the incorporation of the community as a borough. McKinney and Bonwill's map of the borough of Scranton, published that year in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, clearly embodied both the idealistic aspirations of the city's early industrialists and their dramatic modifications of the region's physical environment. Measuring nearly 6 feet square, the map in the gallery is pretty close to that size. The thing is huge, right? The magnificent lithograph featured a plan of the city developed by Joel Amsden, 1812 to 1868, who was born in Hartland, Vermont, and trained as a civil engineer at the Norwich Military University in Norwich, New Hampshire. Hired by George Scranton in 1850 to survey portions of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, a sister enterprise of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, Amsden subsequently worked as an urban planner and architect, organizing downtown Scranton into a grid of intersecting avenues and streets named for, what are they named for? If you're in downtown Scranton, the streets are named for presidents and presidents' trees. Presidents run across town, trees run up and down the hill, right? So that's coming out of Joel Amsden and his plan in 1857. Vignettes of these structures, including the Wyoming House Hotel, 1852, First Presbyterian Church, Public School No. 1, among others, appeared as views drawn from nature by C.E.H. Bonwill, a talented illustrator whose later images of the Civil War were published by Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. In its broad margins, the map of the borough of Scranton included historical statistics on the furnace and municipality, as well as business listings for attorneys, physicians, dentists, druggists, bakers, grocers, tailors, jewelers, carpenters, real estate agents, and liquor dealers. Its schematic layout of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company facilities clearly identified blast furnaces, an engine house, a company store and office, blacksmith shops, a railroad system, and a rolling mill. You can't see this on a PowerPoint slide. You have to see the map. You really have to see the map. Every one of those little drawings is this meticulous image, and all of the streets are marked, all of the buildings are marked. There's a big index that tells who owns what property, what businesses are in the town. So you really can't get a sense of it from the PowerPoint. But when you see it in the gallery, there's an incredible amount of information on that piece of art. These are some details. Scranton is part of what county in 1857? Luzerne, right? Lackawanna hasn't been created yet, so it is still part of Luzerne County. This is the First Presbyterian Church. As you look at works in the exhibition, you will see a church spire in a lot of the photographs and a lot of the paintings. It's a good landmark to kind of use to orient yourself when you look at the pieces. First Presbyterian Church was located basically where Alexander's hair salon is now. So if you know where Alexander's is, you can kind of get your bearings from the First Presbyterian Church. The other big image, pretty much next door to that, would have been the Wyoming Hotel. The Wyoming House Hotel was a very big landmark. And so some of the details, this shows you Lackawanna Avenue and Wyoming Ave. That's the big intersection. Those are the only two streets in downtown Scranton that aren't named for presidents or trees. They're named for valleys, the Lackawanna Valley and the Wyoming Valley. And also down here, kind of where the mall is now, that would be this section. And then this is a roundhouse, so that's pretty much where Steamtown is. It's not the same building. That building, is long gone. But that site is where the Steamtown National Historic Site is basically located today. This is a famous image. You've probably seen this around. We don't have it in the show. It's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. But it is an early image of Scranton, and so you sort of need to deal with it if you're talking about art history. It is by an artist named George Innes, and it is called the Lackawanna Valley. So again, it is in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. You can find a lot of information about it on their website. Their whole collection is digitized and online for the most part. So that's a really neat resource for some art historical research. Anyway, as the expansion of mills, railroads, and commercial buildings transformed Scranton, conflicting perspectives on nature and industry were represented in paintings of the Lackawanna iron furnaces and their surroundings. Romantic-era American authors and artists were often ambivalent about the ways industrial development was changing the natural environment. Writing in 1857, Hollister, again, neither praised nor condemned the appearance of his rapidly evolving community. He's a little iffy about it. This is what he says. The tourist who visits Scranton today may not find as much wildness and sublimity around it as when from the Pocono Range his eye first catches a glimpse of the truly bold outlines of the Delaware Water Gap. He will, nevertheless, as he walks along the walls of Roaring Brook and gazes on the massive piles of the furnace stacks pouring out day after day, ponds of rude or finished iron from the ponderous bar to the delicate bolt, and witnesses the quiet yet resistless motion of the largest stationary steam engine on the American continent, feel proud and pleased with the sights of industry and thrift everywhere around him. So it's not really beautiful, but it's productive. It's productive. So there's got to be some kind of a virtue in that. It's a scene of industry and thrift. And so he's trying to put a good spin on it. But you can tell he's a little on the fence about beauty, whether or not Scranton is beautiful. Similarly, in paintings that glorify both Scranton's rural landscape and the progressive enterprises threatening to obliterate them, artists like George Innes and George Clow wrestled with concepts of the machine in the garden, where disruptive mechanical elements in the landscape were banished or integrated as necessary to preserve the illusion of a harmonious pastoral scene. Following the alliance of Scranton's and Platte with the New York and Erie Railroad, the fortunes of the Lackawanna iron furnaces were closely tied to those of the related mines and railroads. The year 1849, stated Joseph Platt in his reminiscences of 1886, witnessed the beginning of what proved to be developments of great importance, not only to Scranton, but to the entire coal basin and its surroundings. Those interested in the ironworks soon found it was necessary to have a more direct, expeditious, and economical outlet to market their product. The answer was the company's own railroad. The attention of capitalists was called to this project, and sundry parties were brought here to see for themselves the great abundance of coal and the business of the ironworks would give the road, to which the almost universal reply was that they would want an interest in the ironworks also. Thus, work began on two railroads, which ultimately merged into one. The Liggett's Gap Railroad, established in 1849 and renamed the Lackawanna and Western Railroad Company in 1851, combined with the Delaware and Cobb's Gap Railroad, established in 1853, to form, in 1854, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Found along the road for years later, Platt Riley said, were shovels with Scrantons and Platt stamped into the metal of each one. So the furnaces and the railroad really belonged together. They grew up together, they were formed together, and they reinforced each one. So those two businesses really were kind of united in kind of the commercial aspects of what they were doing. In 1855, the artist George Innes met with Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad executives in Scranton to discuss a painting commission. Born in Newburgh, New York, Innes trained at the National Academy of Design in New York City during the 1840s, and then traveled abroad during the early 1850s. Initially, he emulated styles popularized by American painters of the Hudson River School, but later adopted techniques used by French artists of the Barbizon. The trip Innes made to Scranton was stressful. After losing his luggage on the way through Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, the artist, unexpectedly obliged to buy new clothes, wrote home to his wife asking for extra cash. Still, the meeting had a positive outcome, as Innes was hired to produce a painting of the railroad for use in advertising. The resulting oil-on-canvas landscape of the Lackawanna Valley, circa 1856, presented deliberate images of the company's roundhouse, locomotives, and rail lines as seen from the west side of the Lackawanna River, looking east across the valley. So the University of Scranton would be up here, and this is west side, and this is Steamtown, right? So that would have been the roundhouse, and here's where the Lackawanna River runs through. So you're looking over this way in that view. While some of the elements found in the painting were not clearly visible from this vantage point, Innes recalled that railroad officials insisted that the image show the double tracks in the roundhouse, whether they were in perspective or not. So he kind of tilted it up so you could see the roundhouse better. As described in 1867 by publisher Andrew Galatian, whose history of the city of Scranton functioned primarily as an advertising and business directory, the roundhouse, begun in 1855 and completed in 1856, was capable of holding 30 engines. Measuring 225 feet in diameter, it was covered by a dome 98 feet high. Today, while the original roundhouse no longer exists, Steamtown National Historic Site, maintained by the National Park Service, is located in the vicinity where it once stood. Other Scranton landmarks depicted in the Lackawanna Valley included the Wyoming House Hotel. Remember, we just saw that from the map? That would be right here, right? And the First Presbyterian Church. Do you see the tower? The big spire standing above the other buildings? So that would be right there. So this dirt road is Lackawanna Avenue. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western's passenger and freight depots, they're over here along the rail lines. And the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad trestle across the Lackawanna River, which is right here. Today, there is a bridge still in that area, and it's called Bridge 60. If you take the train ride from Steamtown, very often the train will back across Bridge 60. So those are some of the landmarks. These features, which also appeared on McKinney and Bonwell's map of the borough of Scranton, acknowledge the ways in which the railroad had contributed to Scranton's growing prosperity. The price paid for this progress was also clearly indicated in the painting's foreground, where a youth reclined among stumps of trees. Whether or not Innes regarded the stumps as symbols of progress or destruction, however, remains unclear. Despite his attention to detail, the artist idealized his depiction of Scranton's natural, commercial, and industrial landscapes, producing a calm, reflective image where change occurred in a measured and acceptable fashion. So there's a guy here on the hill, and all the trees have been cut down, but he kind of doesn't seem to mind that. He's still, relaxing and enjoying the countryside. That becomes a very idealized image when you compare it to that. By comparison, a photograph of the same view labeled within the Lackawanna Historical Society's collection as Scranton in 1857 recorded within its frenzied web of dirt roads and ramshackle houses the chaos of daily living found in the rapidly expanding boomtown of Scranton. So here's that bridge, right? Bridge 60. Up here would be where Lackawanna Avenue is. Someplace in the mist or the smoke is the roundhouse over to this side of the image. Very, very different. A lot more specific detail, roads, laundry, clapboard siding, all this kind of thing. So big contrast between the painting and the photograph. There's not a lot of information about this photo. There are 2 reprinted versions of it in the gallery. So when you see them, they are reprints. They're beautiful, which means that Whoever took this photo in 1857 did a really wonderful job of it, if it looks that good when it's reproduced digitally, right? They're really gorgeous images. It's probably taken by a man named Thomas Johnson, who we will talk about in a few minutes. Johnson seems to have been one of the few photographers in the area around 1860, and he was also responsible for a series depicting the iron furnaces. So it looks very similar to Johnson's style in terms of the work. Similarly, George Clow idealized harsh processes of iron production in the view of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company furnaces. Structures indicated on McKinney and Bonwell's map of the borough of Scranton likewise appeared in George Clow's pendant paintings of View of the Lackawanna Valley and View of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company furnaces of 1859. A native of Auburn, New York, Clow opened a studio there in 1844 before traveling abroad in 1850. He subsequently painted landscapes in Ohio and New York during the 1860s, turning his attention as well to genre scenes in the 1870s. While Innes acknowledged the environmental consequences of industrialization and urbanization, Clow, through the use of atmospheric perspective, reconciled the contradictions of foundry smoke and hazy hills to produce idyllic scenes of nature and industry. The artist's view of the Lackawanna Valley, presented from a vantage point on the south side of the Lackawanna River, depicted a vista upstream and to the north. Viewers of the painting were safely distanced from the urban landmarks it represented, including the blocky hotel, spired church, and sprawling trestle, by a meandering river and fertile valley prominently featured in the foreground. Any of you know where the Southside McDonald's is? You go down there by the bowling alley, Southside Shopping Center? That's probably the area in general where this was painted from. The Lackawanna River is coming through. There's that Bridge 60 again. There's First Presbyterian Church Tower. So this is Lackawanna Avenue, pretty much, crossing over the river. And you are looking up towards Dunmore. So if you think about Southside today, and you think about the image here in the Clow painting, they're pretty different. So it's kind of fun to compare, again, the landmarks that you can find. Similarly, Clow idealized the harsh processes of iron production in his view of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company furnaces, painted from the south side of Roaring Brook, looking downstream and across the company's facility on the north bank. By this time, the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company was an established enterprise, known for its interest in technological innovation. They were a big company. They were moving forward. They were trying a lot of very new things. It had been among the earliest iron manufacturers to construct anthracite-fueled blast furnaces, to produce American-made T-rails, to utilize steam-powered blowing engines. Only stacks and smoke depicted in Clow's painting, however, suggested that the modest structures shown among leafy groves represented blast furnaces, engine houses, a sawmill, as identified on Amsden's plans. Modes of transportation, too, were endowed with absolute obsolete calm. Clow's small figures, nostalgically portrayed as fording or navigating Roaring Brook by wagon or boat, belied the fact that locomotives routinely moved between the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company sites. So we'll see a photograph in a couple of minutes of this same scene. This is Roaring Brook. It's all very nice and calm. Pretty little white building over here, which is a steam sawmill. And this is a blast furnace, although it's very, very deceptively peaceful at the blast furnace. This building back here is the engine house. So when you see the photographs, remember those, again, those features, and we'll see if we can kind of compare and contrast them. Here we go. Unlike paintings from the same time period, 19th century photographs of the Lackawanna iron furnaces recorded many disconcerting details of the manufacturing process, representing as well diverse concerns of labor and management. In 1857, Selden Scranton left his position as the president of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, returning to Oxford, New Jersey in 1858. His duties were assumed by Joseph Hand Scranton, who had served as company superintendent since 1853. By the time of this transition, the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company had erected 5 blast furnaces, the first being built in 1841, the second and third in 1848, the fourth in 1853, and the fifth in 1857. These faced a large wooden casting shed, where molten iron, after being tapped through an arch at the base of the stack, flowed into beds of damp sand and cooled into small bars called pigs. Power for the furnace's blast of air, which served to raise the temperature inside the stacks while smelting ore, was provided not by the force of water in Roaring Brook, as William Henry had originally intended, but instead by 2 double-connected lever beam engines installed at the furnaces in 1853 and 1854, and considered at the time to be the largest used in America. By 1879, 7 steam engines, housed in an engine house behind and above the furnaces, were in operation. Further upstream, pigs were processed in the company's rolling and puddling mill near Roaring Brook, where the bars of iron were reheated and pressed into various T-rail profiles. The first mill, constructed in 1846, was expanded in 1847 with the addition of the first stationary steam engine in the Lackawanna Valley, used to power machinery for rolling rails. The second mill was built in 1867. In a marked departure from the idealized landscapes of Innes and Clough, the 5 large-scale album imprints by photographer Thomas Johnson, active circa 1850 to 1870, provided a technology-based view of these blast furnaces, engine house, rolling and puddling mills in terms of image and medium. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Johnson trained as a daguerreotypist before taking up glass plate photography. He maintained the Excelsior Skylight Studio in Olean, New York, between 1860 and 1861, till it was destroyed by fire. About this time, Johnson produced a series of 32 scenes along the Delaware and Hudson Canal between Rondout, New York, and Honesdale, Pennsylvania. An advertisement in Scranton's Lackawanna Register newspaper announced that the photographer operated a studio there in 1863. Johnson's Gilt Edge series depicting Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company facilities included scenes of gondola cars, railroad tracks, and machinery parts, surrounding sheds strung with cable. And laborers also entered the picture, demonstrating the intense physicality of their own jobs and the practical limitations of the photographer's craft. Images of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company blast furnaces from the southwest and also blast furnace, engine house, store, and offices from the east offered views of these structures from locations above and below them on Roaring Brook. Facing in the opposite direction from that used by Clough in his view of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company furnaces, Johnson, in his photograph, presented the furnaces in a hollow along a waterway. So this is looking up Roaring Brook, where the painting had been looking down. So this one is opposite. This is that steam sawmill. And again, when you go down to the gallery, you'll see it better. That little white building that looked so pretty and calm and quiet has piles of scrap wood almost up to the roof, and they are throwing things out of the windows. So it's much more hectic and busy. All of those little hills with the pretty green trees and the grass, bare dirt, right? They've scraped it down to the rocks. They're installing railroad tracks. The creek below the dam is practically dry. So there are a lot of differences between the photograph and the painting. More closely related to Clough's painting in terms of vantage point, Johnson's photograph from the east also portrayed the blast furnace stacks. Set flush against the hillside, surmounted by the bridge house and fronted by the casting shed. The engine house, and this is the engine house where the big stationary steam engines were located, was also visible in the painting, as was the trestle over Roaring Brook. Johnson's slightly higher perspective on this scene revealed that the dark, delicate span depicted by Clough was actually a railroad trestle. You wouldn't really know that from the painting. And similarly, that the reason that the creek is calm is because it's been stopped by a man-made dam. It's not a natural, calm stream. It's something that's been diverted for purposes of industrialization. So again, the photograph is giving you a very different view of that building and the way that operations are taking place there. Inside the blast furnaces, and when you see the stone stacks today, you see the big casting arches. You don't see the exterior buildings, the wooden buildings that look like barns. What you see is what would have been inside of those wooden structures. So the big stone arches are still there. This is what would have been called the casting arch. And in an unidentified photograph, again, we don't know the photographer, we don't know the exact date, but it is one of the few images that actually shows workers in some detail in terms of the casting arch and the furnaces and what was happening there. There are 7 or 8 figures who are gathered here, and what they are doing is tapping the arch so that the molten metal will come out, and they are working in the beds of sand to make those trenches where the pigs will form as the iron cools. So again, a very hot, dirty, unidealized image of the kind of work that's happening inside those sheds. Not seen from a distance, the way that it's depicted in the paintings. In keeping with the blast furnace photographs, Johnson's view of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company rolling and puddling mills from the north and from the west were filled with prosaic industrial elements. And in addition, they indicated the great size of the labor force employed by the company. The view of the mills from the north contained images of well over 24 workers. So if you look at this photo again closely in the gallery, you can count dozens of people gathered around outside of that building, grouped in doorways and yards among rail cars and stacks of iron bars. On the distant rise of land across from Roaring Brook, their simple dwellings were shown clustered in Shanty Hill. So Shanty Hill would have been the workers' town over here. It's kind of what's called the nativity section today. Numerous employees also appeared in a photograph taken from the west, as did a group of small white objects in the water of Roaring Brook, which ran parallel to the mills themselves. The forms were blurred since they had moved during the photographer's extended exposure time, but stationary articles on the creek bank revealed their identities. Because these are album imprints, they would have been produced by Johnson on a plate of glass, and they would have had a very long exposure time. The chemicals would need time to react to the light and produce the image. So anything that moved wouldn't show up as a dark and distinct image. So if you look over here along this wall, again, you'll see it better in the gallery. There are 3 or 4 people who wandered around, and you can see them in a couple of different shadowy positions. There's a man here who was wandering back and forth, and you can see him kind of wavering with kind of a shadow image. And then there are also these white, wavery marks in the water. Can anybody tell what they are? They are, as you get closer. And when we had these scanned, again, and digitized for archival purposes, one of the really cool things you can do is zoom up. These are the white objects in the water, and these are the stationary objects that kind of give it away. They're piles of clothing. So they are guys from the mill who have taken off their clothing and gone for a break and gone swimming in the water. That tells you a couple of things, right? It tells you that it was hot, tiresome work, and they needed to take a break and get away from it. It also tells you that they're not really concerned about the quality of that water. And so when we think about 20th and 21st centuries of idea about pollution, right, and environmental consequences in terms of industry, not really an awareness of that in the 1800s, right? It's a long time in coming. The Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company was well established by 1857, but wealth for its founders was still an elusive thing. George Scranton died in 1861. Well regarded by area residents, he was elected to Congress in 1858 and 1860, and his passing was widely mourned. 19th century lawyer historian Edward Merrifield and Frederick Hitchcock, however, noted that the community of Scranton, along with its industrial and commercial investments, didn't reach full maturity until after this date. Officially chartered as a city in 1866, Scranton became the seat of the newly created Lackawanna County in 1878. Of the 3 Scranton family members instrumental in establishing the furnaces, only Joseph Hand Scranton remained in Lackawanna Valley long enough to see the trio's hard work come to a truly profitable fruition. He and his descendants, including his son, William Walker Scranton, his grandson, Worthington Scranton, and great-grandson, William Warren Scranton, who later served as governor of Pennsylvania from 1963 to 1967, continued to live in the city for another century and a half, where they prospered. The images here relate to pieces in the gallery, and the first is a portrait of Joseph Hand Scranton. In 1867, he commissioned architect Russell Sturgis Jr. to plan an elegant residence for his family, and that is here in this image. So in the 1860s, a building known on campus today as the Scranton Estate is constructed by Joseph Hand Scranton. He unfortunately dies in 1871, so he doesn't really live in that building. And the portrait of him here is from about 1872, so you see him overlooking sort of his industrial empire, right? It's out here outside the window, the mills and the railroads. His house really kind of looked that way. It was above the railroad tracks and looked down towards the mill section of the city. Opposite that, again, we would have Shanty Hill, and so these would be the workers' houses. The iron furnaces are here. This is the casting shed, and then over here would be the section of town near the Nativity area today. And again, so you would have the owner's home and then the workers' housing. Joseph Hand Scranton's son, William Walker Scranton, there are a lot of W's in the Scranton family, later inherited the house. So while his father built it, often the Scranton residence, as indicated in this postcard, was called the W.W. Scranton residence. And he was the one who lived in it primarily during the period when it was occupied by Scranton family members. If you see the building today, it looks somewhat different. The tower is gone, but initially it was quite a large building, again, designed in what was called the Second Empire style. and that would have been architect Russell Sturgis's plan for it. When William Walker came into possession of the house, he had it modified and had it kind of a makeover done. So he invited an architect and designer, William Paris, to come in and redesign the interiors. So there are some interesting things that happened with that. William Walker Scranton was also involved in the iron industry, as was his father. But during his career, he broke with the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company and started his own independent iron company called Scranton Steel. So that was a big break. So by 1883, the Scranton Steel Works was established as an independent company and was producing rails in competition with the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company at a facility near the Lackawanna River. In 1891, that competition ended when the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company merged with Scranton Steel, and they became, rather than Lackawanna Iron and Coal, the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company. And it had operations along Roaring Brook in the old location, as well as a new set of facilities along the Lackawanna River, sometimes called the South Works. So by that point, the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company was occupying most of the south side of the city of Scranton. The former Scranton Steel Plant became known as the South Works, and in 1894, the new company manufactured some 500,000 net tons of steel rail. This quantity of T-rail was 1/6 the total national output and equal to 1/3 of that produced in England at the time. To support operations of this magnitude, iron ore was shipped to Scranton from distant sources, including the Lake Superior region. This, local historian Thomas Murphy surmised, prompted a decision late in 1901 to locate plants along Lake Erie in New York so as to be nearer the source of ore supply and take advantage of lake shipments. So what happens by 1902 is that the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company relocates its facilities from Scranton to Buffalo, New York, to be closer to the source of iron coming out of the Mesabi Range across the Great Lakes. From a corporate point of view, this relocation made economic sense. Historians Thomas Leary and Elizabeth Scholes proposed that reductions in fuel consumption rates of blast furnaces, plus the introduction of alternative energy supplies from the byproduct coke ovens, meant that the new integrated steel plants could loosen the ties that had bound their predecessors to the inland coal regions. By moving operations to locations near the Great Lakes, steel manufacturers took advantage of both new ore supplies and new markets for steel and growing industrial centers in the Midwest. Scrantonians saw these events, which cost the city thousands of jobs, from a different perspective. 12 years after the move, Frederick Hitchcock, another local historian, declared that the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company executives had deliberately butchered in cold blood a magnificent $6 million plant. And he says, "Less than a decade and a half ago, we had in full operation one of the largest iron and steel plants in the country. 5 huge blast furnaces were belching forth day and night volcanic-like fires which were the unceasing wonder of the country for miles in all directions. We had 2 of the finest steel mills in the world. This plant had built and occupied most of the south side of our city. It employed upwards of 5,000 men. It was the climax of 60 years' growth. To most of our people today, this story is a dream. So quick and remorseless is oblivion." The achievement of this great enterprise, he lamented, to which Scranton really owes its existence, is splendid history. The crime of its destruction beggars comment. In another 14 years, Murphy also acknowledged the absolute lack of sentiment in big business when Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company moved out, lock, stock, and barrel. Still, he asserted in a slightly more positive way, the loss of the city's main industry hurt, although it did not stop the growth of Scranton. Even as the iron industry failed, the city of Scranton cultivated an expanded sense of self as a modern urban center, where public utilities were an important factor for modernization and growth. After leaving the Scranton Steel Company in 1891, William Walker Scranton became president of the Scranton Gas and Water Company, a business established by his father in 1854. Following his mother's death in 1895, he inherited the family home on Ridge Row and invited designer William Franklin Paris to redecorate the interior around 1904. Born in New York City, the architect and author, who participated in the Paris Exposition in 1900, developed for the Scranton residents an ornate Louis XVI morning room, adorned with carved wood cabinetry and stenciled coffer ceilings. In 1917, Paris published photographs of this space and its decorative elements of architecture. A view of the chamber, its walls hung with portraits of colonial military leaders, painted by artists including William Merritt Chase, demonstrated that the furniture of a man's room reflects the character of the man. Paris was keenly aware of historical continuity. Very marvelous is the impressibility of materials surrounding to the lives which are lived among them, he wrote. We build or we furnish a house to suit our own comfort and taste as it pleases us. We die and our sons inherit it from us and live their lives and maybe add rooms and furniture in accordance with their comfort and their taste. And so generation follows generation. And meanwhile, from all of these lives, something impalpable has been passing into the very walls. In some mysterious way, the whole house has become a reservoir of persuasive, even compelling influence. One is conscious of this influence even in an old house in which we dwell for a time as strangers, and by which we are bound by no ancestry of occupation. So Scranton residence, I think, really kind of ties in with that quote. It passes from one member of the family to another, and ultimately to the University of Scranton. But there is still a character there and a quality, kind of in the architecture itself, that still has a very special presence today. Following William Walker Scranton's death, his widow, Catherine Smith Scranton, lived in the Ridge Row house for nearly 2 decades. After her passing in 1935, the residence became the property of the couple's only son, Worthington Scranton, who donated, with his wife Mary and Marjorie Warren Scranton, the mansion to the newly named University of Scranton, formerly St. Thomas College, in 1941. So Worthington Scranton is Joseph Hand Scranton's grandson. This is his wife, Mary and Marjorie Warren Scranton. They are with, the photograph also shows their 4 children. Mary and Marjorie, who is another daughter, Catherine, Sarah, and the baby on his mother's lap is William Warren Scranton, who will grow up to become the governor of Pennsylvania. So that's kind of a fun family picture. This is the Scranton Estate as it is today at the university. And I mention it here because we will be doing tours tomorrow and also in October. So you get kind of a sense of what the building looks like. It is still very much the way it had been at the time it was redecorated by William Paris. This is the morning room that he is describing with the coffered ceilings and the portraits of the military leaders. There's a stained glass skylight at the top of the stairwell, and then the facade of the building still has the mansard roof and that kind of Second Empire style that was original from the first architect. The architectural remains of the Lackawanna iron furnaces, however, fared less well. Following World War II, Scranton entered an even more extended period of deindustrialization as its railroad and mining operations, like its ironworks, closed or declined. Son of a Presbyterian minister, William Stanley Merwin was born in New York City, but grew up in Scranton during the city's difficult years. Later recognized as the 13th Poet Laureate of the United States, Merwin provided a vivid description of the derelict iron furnaces in a poem from 1960. After 1902, this was all that was left at the furnace site on Roaring Brook. And Merwin, growing up in Scranton in the 30s and 40s, would have seen that sort of imagery, and this was what he kind of thought of it in terms of poetry. The drunk in the furnace. For a good decade, the furnace stood naked in the gully, fireless and vacant as any hat. And then, when it was no more to them than a hulking black fossil, to erode, unnoticed with the rest of the junk hill, by the poisonous creek and rapidly to be added to their ignorance, they were afterwards astonished to confirm one morning a twist of smoke like a pale resurrection, staggering out of its chewed hole, and to remark then other tokens that someone, cozily bolted behind the eye-hold iron door of the drafty burner, had there established his bad castle. Where he gets his spirits, it's a mystery, but the stuff keeps him musical, hammering and anviling with poker and bottle to his jugged bellowings till the last groaning clang, as he collapses onto the rioting springs of a litter of car seats ranged on the grates to sleep like an iron pig. In their tar-paper church, on a text about stokeholes that are sated never, their reverend lingers. They nod and hate trespassers, and when the furnace wakes, though, all afternoon, their witless offspring flock like piped rats to its siren crescendo, and agape on the crumbling ridge, stand in a row and learn. So that's pretty harsh, right? He's got some harsh thoughts about the furnaces standing abandoned in the gully by Roaring Brook. For all of its anger and darkness, Merwin's poem still spoke, however, of unexpected passion and potential. Resurrection was possible at the furnaces, and by extension in the city of Scranton itself. Spirit still existed there. Important lessons remained to be learned, albeit seemingly in unconventional ways, by those who through agape could find within themselves a greater love of all human beings. The word agape means, and he sort of uses it in the word agape, he mimics that, the idea that you can feel compassion for all of humankind. So that's also a factor in that poem. 9 years later, the furnace's future proved to be brighter than Merwin might have believed. In 1969, at the beginning of an era marked by an increased interest in industrial heritage and urban revitalization, the Lackawanna iron furnaces were acquired by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Their stones and brickwork were stabilized by the Department of Environmental Resources, and a 4-acre park created between the stacks and Roaring Brook, where the furnace's casting shed had once been constructed. Control of the newly refurbished furnace site, rededicated as the Scranton Iron Furnaces, passed to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in 1971. Since that time, programs for research and interpretation of the furnaces have been coordinated through their nearby sister site, the Anthracite Heritage Museum. As summarized by Dan Perry, the facility's reputation and status as a center of iron and steel production, along with the related growth of mining, railroading, and textile manufacture they fostered in the region, have earned for Scranton a significant place in the history of America's Industrial Revolution. In recognition of this past importance to the growth of the United States, Scranton Iron Furnaces were listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1991, which is 21 years ago. So we are celebrating the 21st birthday of that nomination. To separate the history of the ironworks from that of Scranton itself, commented Platt in 1889, is impossible. Despite changing economies and technologies, Platt's statement remains true today. In the year 2012, as the Scranton Iron Furnaces celebrate their 21st anniversary of their nomination to the National Register of Historic Places, they continue to be inextricably linked to the 19th century growth, 20th century decline, and 21st century potential of the city that shares their name. So again, that's a pretty recent image of the furnace and some of the things that are happening there. It has been a really active place in the last 3 years. There is an initiative called Arts on Fire that has events in the furnace site every spring. They have a festival. There's an ongoing farmers market there now. So there are a lot of different things that are starting to happen in that area. It's a really, really active center for community events in the past 3 years here in Scranton.